Have you ever noticed how often we inherit beliefs, loyalties, and assumptions without ever stopping to ask whether they're actually true or whether they're just comfortable? And how quickly those habits can shape who we trust, what we accept, and even how we treat other people? Welcome to Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be taking a look at 3 readings from the Christian Bible through the lens of sacred myth. As we reflect on the readings for Easter Sunday, we'll explore what it means to move beyond tribal thinking, to build communities grounded in integrity, and to face life's biggest questions with curiosity instead of assumption. In this episode, we're asking an honest question. What would change if we stopped relying on inherited beliefs and started actively seeking what is true, what is good, and what actually helps people flourish, even when it challenges our habits or our sense of belonging? So grab a comfy seat, a glass of your favorite beverage, and let's look at some ancient stories together in this edition of Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be exploring the readings for Easter Sunday, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. In this series, we're exploring readings from the Bible through the lens of sacred myth, looking for interpretations and lessons that don't require belief in the supernatural. These texts were written by pre-scientific people, shaped by their own cultures, needs, and agendas, not as history books or scientific manuals, but as meaning-making stories for their communities. And just like believers approach these writings through the lens of faith, I approach them through a more humanistic lens, one grounded in the idea that certain foundational values helped humans evolve and flourish. Now, you might agree with the lessons I find, or you might find something completely different. That's the beauty of treating these writings as sacred myth. We're free to negotiate with the text and discover whatever insights we need right now. So with that, let's dive in. As I said, tonight we'll be looking at the readings for Easter Sunday, Cycle A. Our first reading is from Acts of the Apostles. It's chapter 10, verses 34a and 37 through 43. Our second reading is from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, his first letter to the Corinthians. It's chapter 5, verses 6b through 8. And our gospel reading is from John. It's chapter 20, verses 1 through 9. Now we'll start by going through all 3 of the readings, then we'll look for the messages and the main lesson in each one. Finally, we'll bring everything together, look at what it means for us today, and talk about where we go from here. And with that, let's begin. Our first reading is from Acts of the Apostles. Peter proceeded to speak and said, "You know what has happened throughout the province of Judea, beginning in Galilee after the baptism that John preached. How God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, and how he went around doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil, because God was with him. We are witnesses of everything he did in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem. They killed him by hanging him on a cross, but God raised him from the dead on the 3rd day and caused him to be seen. He was not seen by all the people, but by witnesses whom God had already chosen, by us who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. He commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one whom God appointed as judge of the living and the dead. All the prophets testify about him, that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name." Our second reading is from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. "Brothers and sisters, do you know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast so that you may be a new unleavened batch, as you really are. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival, not with the old bread leavened with malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." And our gospel reading is from John. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. All right, so those are the readings for this coming Sunday, Easter Sunday, and believers read them and only see stories and writings about the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. But when we look at these stories through our lens of sacred myth, we recognize that the resurrection of someone who has been tortured, crucified, and dead for 3 days is not scientifically possible. It's supernatural. It's mythological. That means we need to find something else. So let's go back and take a critical look at these readings and see what other non-supernatural learnings and lessons we can find if we dig around just a little bit. So our first reading was from Acts of the Apostles, and one of the most powerful shifts in this passage is the rejection of partiality, the realization that people shouldn't be judged based on where they come from, who they belong to, or what group they're part of. We need to be impartial when it comes to those things. From a human perspective, that's a big deal, because tribal thinking is one of the oldest instincts we have. It's how we simplify the world. Us versus them, insiders versus outsiders. But it's also one of the fastest ways to create division and to justify unfair treatment. This moment challenges that instinct and replaces it with something more fair, evaluating people based on what they actually do. And that naturally leads to a second idea, which is character over pedigree, over one's inherited place in society. In other words, it's not what label you carry, not what tradition you inherited. It's about how you show up in the world. Do you act with integrity? Do you contribute to the well-being of others? Do your choices reflect empathy and fairness? That's a much harder standard because it applies to everyone equally. It removes the shortcuts. You can't rely on identity or affiliation to carry you. You have to live it out in your actions. Now, there's also a deeper layer here about growth, about the willingness to change your mind. The shift happening in this passage doesn't come easily. It requires unlearning assumptions and letting go of certain long-held beliefs about who belongs and who doesn't. That kind of openness takes humility. It means admitting that your previous way of seeing the world might have been incomplete or even wrong. And in a time when people tend to double down on their positions, that kind of intellectual flexibility is kind of rare. But it's absolutely necessary if we want to move forward together. Anyway, the main lesson I got from our first reading is that real progress begins when we judge people by their actions, not their identity. This reading gives us a very practical framework for how we relate to each other. Stop sorting people into categories that determine their worth before they even act. Start paying attention to how they actually live, how they treat others, and what they contribute to the world around them. That shift alone in your thinking can change how we build relationships, It can change how we structure communities, even how we define justice. Real progress begins when we judge people by their actions, not their identity. Our second reading was from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. And this passage leans on a simple but powerful idea. A little bit of something, good or bad, doesn't stay contained for long. It spreads. That's Paul's metaphor about yeast. And when it comes to human behavior, that's especially true. The attitudes we tolerate, the shortcuts we justify, the corners we cut, they don't just affect us individually. They tend to ripple outward. Culture isn't built by big speeches or mission statements. Culture is built by patterns, repeated actions, shared norms. And those norms can either strengthen a community or quietly erode it from the inside out. That's where integrity comes in, not as a buzzword, but as consistency. It's the alignment between what we say we value and how we actually behave even when no one's watching. Because communities don't fail all at once. They drift slowly, like one compromise at a time. And the dangerous part is that those compromises, they often feel small in the moment, harmless even. But when enough people make the same small exception, it stops being an exception, and it becomes the standard. So the real challenge here isn't about perfection. It's about awareness and responsibility. It's about recognizing that we are constantly shaping the environments that we're part of, whether we realize it or not. And that means being willing to take an honest look at what we're contributing. What habits need to go away? What negative behaviors are we normalizing? And what does it actually look like to clean things out in a way that creates something healthier, more honest, and more aligned with the kind of life we say we want to live? Anyway, the main lesson I got from our second reading is that small choices shape the character of a community. When you zoom out, this isn't just about avoiding bad behavior. It's about intentionally building something better. A stronger community rarely happens by accident. It's usually the result of people choosing over and over again, choosing to act with clarity, honesty, and a lot more care for each other. Because even the smallest choices don't stay small for long. Small choices shape the character of a community. Okay, our final reading was from the Gospel of John. And what stands out in this passage isn't just the mystery. It's really the response to it. First of all, no one stays put. No one settles for secondhand information. They go, they look, they examine. And that's a deeply human instinct at its best, the drive to understand what's real, not just what we've been told. In a world full of assumptions and inherited beliefs, there's something powerful about choosing direct experience over passive acceptance. It's the difference between living on autopilot and actively engaging with reality. The irony, of course, is that these lessons about looking and examining the evidence yourself are shared using a story about a supernatural, unprovable event, but the lessons are still solid. For example, even with the same evidence, the people didn't all arrive at the same place in the same way. And one sees and reacts quickly. Another needs to step inside to get closer, to process it more slowly. That variability matters. It reminds us that understanding isn't a one-size-fits-all sort of process. People bring their own perspectives, their own pace, their own questions. And instead of forcing a set of uniform conclusions, there's value in allowing space for that difference. Because growth often happens in the tension between what we see and what we're still trying to make sense of. And maybe the most honest part of this story is that it doesn't wrap everything up neatly. There's no full explanation. Just a shift from grief and confusion to movement and possibility. That's where curiosity becomes essential. Not as a quick fix, but as a commitment to keep going, to keep asking, to keep exploring, even when the answers aren't immediately available. Because uncertainty isn't a failure of understanding, it's the starting point of it. So the main lesson I got from our gospel reading is that growth begins when we face the unknown with curiosity instead of fear. When we stop demanding immediate answers and start engaging with the unknown, something changes. We move from being stuck in confusion or despair to becoming active participants in our own understanding. We begin to build meaning through observation and reflection and honest inquiry. And that shift, as simple as it sounds, that's where real growth begins. Growth begins when we face the unknown with curiosity instead of fear. All right, let's review the lessons we've talked about so far. In our first reading from Acts, the main lesson I came away with was real progress begins when we judge people by their actions, not their identity. In our second reading from 1 Corinthians, the main lesson I got was small choices shape the character of a community. And finally, the main lesson I got from our gospel reading was growth begins when we face the unknown with curiosity instead of fear. When you step back and look at these three readings together, they're really pointing us toward a very practical way of living. One where we stop hiding behind labels and shortcuts or assumptions, and where we actually engage with the world as it is. We move beyond tribal thinking, and we start valuing people by what they do, not where they come from. We recognize that our daily choices, as small as they seem in the moment, are constantly shaping the culture around us, for better or worse. And when we hit those moments of uncertainty or confusion, instead of freezing or defaulting to someone else's answers, we lean in, ask questions, and go find out for ourselves. Put all of that together and you get a life that's grounded, intentional, and very real. A life built on evidence instead of assumption, integrity instead of convenience, and a deep respect for the inherent worth of every person we encounter. So let's step back and take another look at these readings overall and see if we can figure out what these lessons really mean to us in our daily lives. To do this, I'll try to answer two questions. So what and now what? Okay, so what? Why should we care about any of this? Well, we should care about this because tribal thinking is tearing people apart in real time. It's not abstract. It shows up in how we vote, how we treat neighbors, how we decide who deserves help and who doesn't. When we default to loyalty over fairness, we stop seeing people as human beings and start seeing them as categories. And once that happens, it becomes a lot easier to justify doing harm. This is important because integrity isn't just personal. Integrity is structural. When small compromises become normal, entire systems start to rot. We see it in politics, media, workplaces, places where bending the truth or looking the other way becomes just how things work. But that erosion doesn't stay contained. It spreads. And eventually, nobody trusts anything or anyone. We should care about this because we're living in a post-truth environment where confidence often replaces evidence. It's easier than ever to believe something just because it feels right or fits our side or the person saying it just sounds like they know what they're talking about. But if we stop checking, stop questioning, stop looking for ourselves, we become very, very easy to manipulate. The ability to say, I don't know yet, and then go find out, that's not weakness. That's protection. This is important because in the grand scheme of things, what we do matters more than what we claim to believe. You can have all the right labels, all the right language, but if your actions don't reduce harm or increase well-being, it's all empty. A better world isn't built on declarations. It's built on consistent everyday choices to do good where you are. We should care about this because if even a small group of people committed to truth over tribe, integrity over convenience, and action over identity, even if they did that for a week, you wouldn't just feel the difference, you'd see it. And the last question I try to answer is, now what? What are we supposed to do? Well, when you really start paying attention to how you move through the world, how you form opinions, how you respond to people, how you make decisions, when you pay closer attention to that, you begin to notice something uncomfortable. A lot of what feels like conviction might actually be habit or loyalty or just the path of least resistance. And if we're honest, those things can quietly steer us away from what's actually true or good without us even realizing it. So, with that in mind, here's your question for the week. In what area of my life am I letting tribal loyalty or old habits cloud my judgment of what is actually true and good? Now, this question matters because it gets underneath the surface. It's not asking what you believe. It's asking why you believe it and whether that belief still holds up when you really examine it. And that has real practical impact. It can change how you show up in conversations, how you treat people who think differently from you, and how you make decisions at work, at home, or in your community. It can help you catch yourself before you repeat something untrue, before you dismiss someone unfairly, or even before you double down on something just because that's what my side believes. Several years ago, I was assigned to be the Section 508 program manager at the U.S. Department of Labor. Now, Section 508 is all about making sure that federal technology is accessible to people with disabilities. And when I stepped into that role, I'll be honest with you, I didn't know much about it at all. So I did what a lot of us probably do when we're thrown into something new. I read everything I could get my hands on for a couple of weeks, trying to build some sort of knowledge foundation. And there's a point where reading isn't enough, though. I had to get out and start talking to people, the folks who had been doing this work for years. And pretty quickly, I realized something that was both humbling and incredibly important. Even though I was in charge of the program, I definitely was not the expert in the room, not even close. So I had a choice to make. I could pretend I had all the answers, which is what other supervisors sometimes did, or I could lean into the expertise around me and then keep learning. And here's where it got interesting. Those experts, they didn't always agree with each other. Different perspectives, different approaches, different priorities, which meant I had to get comfortable with something that a lot of us resist, which is ambiguity. There wasn't always a clean, obvious answer. There were trade-offs, gray areas, competing viewpoints, and over time I had to learn how to listen more carefully, ask better questions, and sometimes just sit with uncertainty a little longer than I wanted to. I'll be honest, I didn't really like that. I was used to finding the answer and then understanding it inside and out. And if there was more than one potential answer, my old habit was to choose the one I liked best and then stick with it and learn how best to defend and protect it. But that habit didn't serve me well when it came to the complexities of digital accessibility, especially in the midst of rapidly changing technologies. had to learn to be okay with ambiguity. As the years went on, I did develop expertise, especially around policy, law, and process improvement. But even then, I had to stay flexible. There were plenty of times I'd walk into a conversation pretty confident in my position and walk out realizing I needed to adjust it. Not because I was ignorant or weak or indecisive, but because I was still learning, still refining, still trying to get it right within a rapidly changing technological environment. And honestly, that's the lesson that stuck with me. Being willing to change your mind when new information shows up isn't a failure. It's a skill. And it's one that most of us could stand to practice a hell of a lot more, especially in the areas of life where we feel the most certain. So spend some time with our question. In what area of my life am I letting tribal loyalty or old habits cloud my judgment of what is actually true and good? Because here's the payoff. When you start doing this regularly, you build a kind of internal clarity that's not based on the need for certainty. And that makes everything else easier. You become less reactive, more thoughtful, and a lot harder to manipulate. You don't get sucked in as easily by outrage or pressure or groupthink. Instead, you start making decisions that actually align with your values, not just with your affiliations or your old habits. And that's where real growth happens. Well, before I wrap things up, I'd like to leave you with one more thought. The 13th century Persian poet and Sufi mystic Rumi once wrote, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." That line hits a nerve, doesn't it? Because most of us are used to living inside those categories. Right versus wrong, us versus them, my side versus your side. And to be clear, this isn't about abandoning ethics or pretending everything is relative. It's about recognizing how often those categories get weaponized, how quickly they turn into shortcuts that replace real understanding. What Rumi is pointing to is something deeper, a space where we stop performing certainty and just start encountering reality as it actually is. And that connects directly to the question we just asked. Where am I letting tribal loyalty or old habits cloud my judgment of what is actually true and good? Because you can't answer that question honestly if you never leave your side. You can't see clearly if you're always defending a position instead of examining it. That field Rumi is talking about, that's where the work happens. It's where you drop the need to be right long enough to ask, what's actually going on here? What's real? What's fair? What's human? It also demands integrity, because it's one thing to say you value truth. It's another to step into a space where your assumptions might not hold up. That's uncomfortable. It means letting go of the performance, the certainty, the identity tied to being the one who's right. I'll admit, this is a tough one for me. But that space where I try to leave my assumptions behind is also the space where sincerity shows up. That's where your values stop being abstract and start becoming something you actually live. And finally, I think this quote invites investigation. Just like we talked about earlier, you don't stay at a distance and rely on secondhand narratives. You go see, you engage, you listen, you gather real information, even when it challenges you. That field beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing isn't theoretical. It's where real people are, with real experiences and real consequences. So if you're serious about that question this week, this is what you do. Find your field. Step outside the noise, the labels, the habit of taking your side's word for everything. Go where the humanity is. Go where the evidence is. And be willing to meet it honestly, even if it changes you. All right, we've come to the end of this episode. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again next week. But in the meantime, I encourage you to engage with our question for the week and pay attention to the important lessons you come across wherever you find them. You'll create a more purposeful and joyful life, and you'll start to feel more connected to the world and the people around you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mythologizing the Bible as we did a deeper dive into the readings for Easter Sunday, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. Remember that our daily choices, small as they seem, are constantly shaping the culture around us, for better or worse. The Bible readings used for this episode are from the Holy Bible New International Version, NIV, copyright 1973, 1978, 1984, and 2011 by Biblica Inc., used by permission, all rights reserved worldwide. Thank you for listening. If you like this content, please consider telling a friend about it. The more people who hear the positive messages I'm sharing, the better. Mythologizing the Bible is a live-streamed series held most Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/thecodaproject. Every week, the audio of these Mythologizing the Bible presentations is released as a podcast. You can find the podcast at thecodaproject.com or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Pocket Casts. To learn more, to subscribe to my mailing list, and to keep up on everything I'm doing with the Coda Project, please visit thecodaproject.com.